Our next Federalist Society event is on Thursday. Don't forget that. And I'll turn it over to our president, Ron Sharma, to introduce our speakers.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to what's the second of our third event this week. This is a debate on extraordinary rendition. Is it a necessary tool in the war on terror, or is it unlawful torture by proxy? At the request of both speakers, the topic is actually going to be a little bit more broader than just extraordinary renditions. It's going to include torture generally, Guantanamo Bay, sort of the general war on terrorism, the philosophical questions associated with that moving forward. I'll give a quick introduction to the speakers, but before that, I just want to remind you of our debate format. It'll be 12 minutes as an introduction for each speaker, then a 10-minute rebuttal for each speaker, starting with our guest speaker, Professor Sales. He'll be then followed by Professor Quigley, right here at Ohio State. And then following that, we'll have questions taken from you, the audience. So I do want to give a quick pitch. So before we get started, we do have an event on Thursday. That one is on. It's a John Templeton Society Big Questions debate series. So we hope you'll come out for that one. It's on natural law and the role of religion, whether it's sustainable for that. I'll give a quick introduction for each speaker, starting with Professor Sales. Before beginning work as Professor George Mason, Professor Sales was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Development at the United States Department of Homeland Security. He previously served as counsel and then senior counsel in the Office of Legal Policy at the U.S. Department of Justice. In 2002, he received the Attorney General's Award for Exceptional Service at the Justice Department's highest honor for his role in drafting the USA Patriot Act. Professor Sales has also collaborated on publications by the Heritage Foundation. He's a graduate of Duke Law School, magna cum laude, where he joined the Order of the Coit and was research editor for the Duke Law Journal. He clerked for the Honorable David Santelli of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and from 2003 to 2005, he practiced at Washington, D.C. law firm of Wiley, Ryan, and Felding. He was the John M. Owen Fellow at the Georgetown Law Center in 2005 and 2006. Professor Quigley, of course, the fan favorite here at Ohio State. He teaches both international and comparative law, and he's been a faculty member since 1969. Professor Quigley spent a year as a visiting professor in Tanzania before coming to the university, and he served as a research scholar at Moscow State University. At Harvard Law School, he was a research associate in comparative law. He earned his JD. Active in international human rights work, Professor Quigley has written numerous books and articles on international law, the United Nations, and human rights. In 1995, he received the university's Distinguished Scholar Award for his outstanding scholarly achievements. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sales.
Thanks very much, Lana. I'd like to thank the Federalist Society and the Military Law Society for hosting this debate and having me out to Columbus. It's great to be back in Ohio. Let me just say, as an Ohio native and a lifelong Buckeye fan, I hope that whoever is keeping score in the audience will give me due extra credit for that. As Aman said, I'd like to talk about not just rendition, but to situate the problem of extraordinary rendition in the larger context of issues surrounding detention, interrogation, targeted killing, and other issues that arise in connection with our conflict with Al-Qaeda. I want to make what I think is a counterintuitive claim. I'll state it now and then explain what I mean by it over the course of the next 11 and a half minutes. My claim is this. For civil libertarian reasons, the American intelligence community should be permitted to engage in modestly coercive interrogations. Now, let me emphasize the first part of that claim. For civil libertarian reasons, my claim is not that mildly coercive interrogation is good from a national security standpoint, but rather that mildly coercive interrogation has important civil libertarian benefits. What do I mean by mildly coercive? Here's a preview, not waterboarding, but stay tuned and I'll tell you more about what I have in mind. All right, to situate my claim, I want to spend a couple minutes rehashing some basic legal doctrine and historical context to see how we got to where we are today with respect to interrogation. The United Nations Convention Against Torture requires all signatories to make it a criminal offense to engage in torture. Right? The United States ratified this treaty and complied with that obligation in 1994. The Congress enacted and the President signed legislation known as the Federal Torture Statute. The Federal Torture Statute defines torture thusly, specifically intending to inflict severe physical or mental pain or suffering. Right? In addition to requiring states to ban torture, the UN Convention Against Torture also requires states to prohibit what's known as cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Think of that as torture light. It's a form of abuse that's odious, but that doesn't quite rise to the level of prohibited, indeed criminal torture. The United States, in 2005, implemented its international obligations with respect to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. The Detained Treatment Act makes it unlawful for any federal official to subject a person in his or her custody to CID. Right? We all know that a number of interrogation techniques were used by the CIA over the past decade, about which credible claims have been made that they offend both the ban on cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, as well as the strict federal and international prohibition on torture. The techniques that were authorized by the Bush administration that the CIA undertook range from fairly benign to fairly severe. The fairly benign techniques include things like attention grasp and dietary manipulation. Dietary manipulation means, well, we're putting you on liquid Ensure shakes instead of hot rations for a couple of weeks, right? Not pleasant, but not pulling people's fingernails off. Attention grasp, that's grabbing somebody by the collar and getting right in their face. The more severe, indeed quite severe techniques included waterboarding, which as we know is a form of simulated drowning, intended to produce a sensation of suffocation and panic at the prospect of being suffocated. And also fairly lengthy periods of sleep deprivation, several days, maybe up to a week, depending on the circumstances. So fast forward to 2009. In 2009, his second full day in office, President Obama issues an executive order prohibiting torture, and more particularly requiring that all CIA interrogations comply with what's known as the Army Field Manual. The Army Field Manual is a document that lays out a number of authorized interrogation techniques and restricts a number of other interrogation techniques. So let's spend a couple minutes thinking about what those legal limits are and the legal basis for the limits of the Army Field Manual. First of all, the Army Field Manual prohibits interrogators from using any sort of threat against a captive, against a detainee. Right? You can't say, for instance, cooperate with us or we're going to send you to Guantanamo Bay. You can't say, tell us the truth, tell us when the next attack is coming, or else we're going to see to it that you never set foot outside of prison again. Now, if these sorts of threats sound familiar, that's because they should. Right? These sorts of low-grade prosecutorial threats are pretty much a garden variety staple of FBI interrogations and local police interrogations as well. Police officers, FBI agents routinely use low-grade threats. We're going to seek the death penalty unless you cooperate, to induce cooperation from criminal suspects. Under the Army Field Manual, the CIA is not permitted to use the same sort of technique. We've all heard of the good cop, bad cop routine, right? Well, the military calls it Mutt and Jeff. Mutt and Jeff is pretty strictly regulated under the Army Field Manual, and therefore under the Obama executive order. There's a presumption against doing good cop, bad cop routine. In order to do it, you have to get the approval of an 06 officer, that's colonel rank, so fairly senior approval requirement before you can even think about doing good cop, bad cop. Solitary confinement, another garden variety technique used in ordinary law enforcement to induce compliance and to discipline recalcitrant prisoners. Again, there's a very strong presumption under the Army Field Manual against confining prisoners in solitary confinement, and an equally strong presumption against using that as a technique to try and elicit information. In fact, it's arguable that you're not even allowed to yell during the course of an interrogation under the Army Field Manual. There used to be a technique known as fear up harsh. The idea was to behave in an intimidating manner so as to cause the interrogatee, the detainee, to weaken in resistance and have their will overcome by not an explicit threat of force, but by loud, boisterous behavior. Fear Up Harsh was removed as an authorized technique from the Army Field Manual just a few years ago. So it's not clear at this point whether CIA interrogators, if they capture Osama bin Laden, can even raise their voices, right? Now, the bottom line takeaway here is that the CIA is currently subject to restrictions on interrogation that are stricter, and maybe quite a bit stricter, than the limits that we apply in ordinary criminal investigations. The FBI is allowed to use techniques to investigate healthcare fraud that the CIA is not permitted to use to investigate acts of international terrorism. I want to drop a footnote here. We can come back to this later on during Q&A or in rebuttal if you're interested. I don't believe that any of these restrictions are required by domestic or international law. In other words, the good cop, bad cop routine, I don't believe constitutes torture under domestic law or international law, nor do I believe that the good cop, bad cop routine amounts to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment in violation of domestic or international law. As I said, happy to talk about that subsidiary claim in the future, but let's move on to what I think is the most important observation I'll make today. What are the consequences of these interrogation restrictions? Right? We all know that waterboarding is a pretty brutal practice and ought not be condoned. But what about restrictions on fairly innocuous, fairly mild coercive interrogation techniques, such as raising your voice at Osama bin Laden? And this is where we get to the nub of my claim, which is that modestly coercive interrogation is desirable in some sense because of the possible civil libertarian advantages. All right, so what do I mean by that? Well, the basic idea here is substitution effect. As the price of one commodity increases over the short run and even over the long run, consumers will simply shift to another commodity, right? If Coke costs $1 a can and Pepsi costs 50 cents a can, you know, at the margins, people will tend to drink more Pepsi than Coke. Well, what in the world does that have to do with interrogation, rendition, and targeted killing? Well, because the restrictions on interrogation are so severe, they effectively increase the cost to the CIA and to the government as a whole of engaging in interrogation. Because interrogation has become comparatively costly, there will be, I predict, a substitution effect. And other counterterrorism measures will be embraced because counterterrorism interrogations are no longer a viable option. And I want to make the claim that many of these alternative policies, many of these substitutes for interrogation, are even more problematic than mildly coercive interrogation. Consider first, as an example, targeted killing. If we can't take somebody into custody and subject them to a meaningful interrogation regime, at the margins, the CIA, the armed forces, will simply tend to kill them instead, right? Why run the risk of taking them into custody if we can't extract information from them? Let's just blow them up on the battlefield, right? And there's some empirical evidence. I mean, it's anecdotal, but there is some evidence that we actually have begun to see an uptick in targeted killing, in part as a response to the prohibition on even mildly coercive interrogation. So, for instance, the Obama administration has begun to increase its use of Predator drones in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and actually even outside that theater of war. How much of that increase is due to the prohibition on even mildly coercive interrogation? It's hard to say unless you have the requisite security clearances. There are a few anecdotal accounts in Washington Post and LA Times where unnamed military officials say, we weren't really in favor of blowing up this particular caravan of terrorists. We wanted a prisoner so we could interrogate them, but we weren't allowed to do it. Take it for what it's worth. There's probably lots of other reasons why targeted killing has become more common, but I think at a minimum, the prohibition on even mildly coercive interrogation helps account for at least part of that increase. So what's wrong with that? Isn't it a good thing to kill terrorists, right? Well, yeah, perhaps, but Predator drones don't just kill Osama bin Laden and his lieutenants. They also have the nasty tendency of killing innocent bystanders, the wives of Al-Qaeda operatives who happen to be nearby, the children of Al-Qaeda operatives who are playing on a playground when the Hellfire missile strikes the compound, right? So there's a very real civil liberties cost, right? The most fundamental civil liberties cost imaginable, right? Deprivation of life. And the people who are losing their lives, or some of the people who are losing their lives, are totally innocent bystanders, right? Maybe we don't worry about what some would call extrajudicial